Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Nun Bet. Zo misvat haniskalin. Mai tana dekatane, zo misvat haniskalin. The very first Mishnah in our Perek that we are still commenting on gave the four types of capital punishment according to Tanakama and according to the Bishimon. They have different orders. And then the Mishnah ended with the curious words, this is the mitzvah of those who are stoned. So the Gemara is asking, what does this mean? What is the Tana teaching us when it says this is the way that you do stoning? What is this referring to? I mean, it mentions stoning in this Mishnah, but it meant just what's one word, and then it mentions all the other ones also. Mishum de Tana nigmar hadin mosinoto lesoklo bet hasikila hayagavo shte komot va'ideteka ba'el mitna bisvat anisrafin Tana namezo misvat aniskalin. And so Gemara explains that actually the first Mishnah in this Perek is referring back to the last Mishnah in the previous Perek. Before, in the previous Perek, it said once the judgment, the verdict is done, then they take him out to be stoned. It was assuming an example where the person, the convict, deserves stoning. And then, so since it mentioned that, it already described how you do stoning. You go 2 stories up and you throw him down and push him down, and then the other witness takes the stone, and we saw all that already. So, since it already went through the procedure for Sikila that ended the previous Perek, and now it mentioned, oh, this is not the only type of capital punishment, there's 3 others. So it listed all 4 and it listed them in order. And the next Mishnah that we're about to see is mitzvah tanisrafin. This is the mitzvah, or really it's the process of how you do execution by burning. So since it's about to say that, so it ends the Mishnah. This Mishnah in our Perek ends, that was how you did Sikila. We finished that already in the previous Perek. And so now I want to tell you about the next type of capital punishment. Okay, good. So now we understand the order of the Mishnayot. Mitzvah hanisrafin hayu mishakin oto bezebel al ad arku botav notenin sudar kasha letoch haraka vekorech al savaro. So here's how you do burning. You might think that you just throw the person into a big fire, into a big bonfire, but that's not so. Rather, it's going to be burning from the inside in order to preserve the dignity of the body on the outside. As we will see, it's pouring molten metal down the person's throat, which is not supposed to be pleasant. That's not the point, but it's supposed to be more honorable, because if a body is burnt in a big fire, that's really horrible and disfigures the body. Whereas this, it may be, I don't know which one's more painful, but in any case, this one's probably less painful, probably is quicker. But in any case, the main point is that it preserves the dignity of the body, which is still b'tselem Elokim, even for a criminal. So here's what they would do. They would take the convict and submerge him into dung up to his knees. This is so to keep him stable, so he doesn't move around. And then they would take a rough scarf and put it into a soft one. In other words, we need some strength because we're gonna strangle him a little bit just to get his mouth open. And if we use, so we need a strong rope. But if you use a strong rope, it might be abrasive. And so we wrap the strong rope or strong scarf into a soft one so that it'll be soft on his skin, which is really interesting because we're about to kill this guy by first strangling him to get his mouth open and then pouring molten lead down his throat. And yet we are careful to worry not for him not to suffer anything that is not needed, the least possible. And so therefore, if you feel a scratchy rope or a scratchy, thick, coarse garment on the skin of his neck, and that would be very uncomfortable. And so we put a soft one around it. You can't just use a soft one because it's not strong enough. It might break when they pull it. Okay, so this is, the attention to detail is just amazing here. And so they put it around his neck. And so now you have this kerchief around his neck, and the 2 witnesses are pulling on it in different directions so that he is choking a little, and then he would open his mouth mouth to try to gasp for air. Now, the point is not to strangle him. This is not strangulation. We're going to get to that later, but we need his mouth to be open, so this is a way to do it. And we light a wick and we throw it into his mouth. I'll explain that this wick is in fact metal, a long piece of metal, and it goes down into his intestines and burns in his intestines from the inside, and he dies. I'm not sure if he dies from lack of breath from the metal going down. I imagine it would cool down and block his airways, or maybe it's from burning, from heart failure. I don't know exactly what he would die from first, but it would be a relatively quick death, it seems. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afu imet biadam lo hayu mekaymin bo misvat serefa. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees regarding the kerchief, because if he dies by strangulation while they're pulling the kerchief in both ways, then they're not fulfilling burning. And if someone deserves serefa, which is worse, so then they should get serefa and not be killed beforehand by strangulation. Ela potechet piv bisvat shelo betobato. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda says, we take tongues and we open up his mouth by force, and that way his mouth is open. And then we light the wick and throw it down, and it burns him from the inside of his intestines. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok, Maaseh bebat kohen achat shezineta v'kifuha chabilei zemurot usrafuha. However, Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok says there was a story of a bat kohen who committed adultery, as we saw in the previous dapim, and she deserved serefa. And they took her and they wrapped her in bundles of branches and burned her like a bonfire, not from the inside like this Mishnah said, just regular burning. Amru lo mipnei shelo haya betin shelota sha'a baki. But the other sages told Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok, yeah, we know that story, but that was done by a court that didn't know what they were doing. They were not proficient. They didn't know the correct law. So it seems that there was at least one, maybe a certain time period when it was in fact burning, and the Gemara will explain what's the deal with this betin. I mean, this is a pretty significant thing to get wrong. So how did they get this wrong? Gemara will explain. My petilan, what does it mean a wick? Amar Rab Matana petila shel avar. We're talking about a wick of lead. It's the shape of a wick, but actually is a long piece of lead, which I guess would be easier to melt if it's a long thin piece rather than it's a big block. Minalan atya serefa me'adat korach. Ma lehlan serefat neshama veguf kayam afkan serefat neshama veguf kayam. Now, how do you know that the Mishnah, that when the Torah says serefa, and it does give that punishment for various things, how do you know that means burning from the inside and not burning from the outside like a bonfire? We learn a gezerah shava serefa when in the context of capital punishment, and it says serefa in the context of adat korach when they had the contest with the fire pans and they lost. The people with Korach. Korach himself went underground, but the other people that were with him did the fire pan test, and they were consumed by fire. Now, how were they consumed? That was serefat neshama, meaning from the inside, but their body remained intact. So too, for capital punishment, we kill the person from the inside, but the body remains intact. So that's where we learn it from. Rabbi Elazar Amar, Atya serefat b'nei Haron, ma'lalan serefat neshama v'guf kayam, afkan serefat neshama v'guf kayam. Rabbi Elazar says, no. We learn, the same gezerah serefat, but not from Adat Korach, but rather from the Bnei Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, when they brought an incense, ketoret, zara, and they were also burnt by fire, a divine fire that came down, and that divine fire burnt them from the inside, not from the outside. So too, capital punishment is from the inside, while the body is intact. Okay, good. So we have two different places to learn it from, and now we're going to compare them to wonder how come Rabbi Elazar doesn't learn from this and vice versa. מאן דאליף מעדת קורח מנעלה, כדכתיב את מחתות החטאים האלה בנפשותם, שנשמתם נשרפת וגוף קיים. Now, the first opinion that learned it from Korach, how does he know that Adat Korach was killed from the inside and not from the outside? Oh, because the pasuk says the fire pans of these men who have sinned with their souls. So in a simple reading, it just means they sinned with they sinned, their souls sinned, they themselves sinned. But the Gemara is explaining it as it means that their punishment was to their souls, meaning to their inside was burnt, but their body remained intact. So that's where we learned that Adat Korach was so, and the Gezerah Shava. From there, we learn capital punishment also is from the inside. V'idach, now the other opinion, to be Elazar, who says we learn from Bnei Aharon, he will say, no, Adat Korach was actually burned by fire from the outside. Umay benafshotam, shintchayevu sedefal diskeh nafshotam. So why say nafshotam if, in fact, they were burned from the outside? Nafshotam implies on the inside, because they were liable to serefa because of matters of their soul, or really of their body. This means, like when we say ochel nefesh, something that sustains the body. So what did they do wrong in terms of their body that got them into this trouble? Kideresh Lakish Damaresh Lakish. Mai dichti bechanfe laage maog harok alai shinemo. Kideresh Lakish said, what does this pasuk in Tehillim mean? With the flattering mockeries of spitefulness, they gnash at me with their teeth. Who is this referring to? What is this referring to? Bishvil chanupa shechenifu lekorach aliske legima harak alehen sar shel gehinam shinav. It's because of the flattery that the people, that Korach, gave to Korach, because of ligima, because of eating. In other words, Korach would go and wine and dine these chieftains, these other important people, and he got them on his side by bribing them with food, and then they flattered him. And because of that, they deserve death by the minister of Gehinam. So that's what nafshotam means in the pasuk here. It means because of the food that Korach fed them and bribed them to go over to his side. But it does not mean that they were killed from the inside. According to this opinion of Rabbi Elazar, actually Adat Korach was burnt in a regular way from the outside. That therefore he doesn't learn Gezerah Shava from there. Now Rabbi Elazar, who learns from Bnei Aharon that they were killed from the inside, so too capital punishment is from the inside. How does he know that Bnei Aharon were killed from the inside? Well, the pasuk says Vayamutu, they died before Hashem. So Vayamutu means they died. How do most people die? A natural death. When people die a natural death, their body remains intact. They got a heart attack or whatever that happens on the inside, but their body remains intact. And so too Nadav and Avihu, although it was a divine death, it was like a natural death. V'idach. Now, what's the other opinion going to say about that? They'll say, no, Nadav and Avihu were actually burned from the outside. In that case, why does it say they died, which sounds like a natural death? It means they started on the inside like a natural death, but in the end, they were burnt on the outside too. Abai Yosef ben Dostai Omer, Shnei Hutin shel Esh Yasu mibet Kodesh HaKodashim. נחלקו לארבע, ונכנסו שניים בחותמו של זה ושניים בחותמו של זה, ושרפום, as a Braita teaches, Rabbi Yosef ben Dostai says, that there were two threads of fire that emerged from the Kodesh Kodashim, and then the two split into four, and those four streams went into the nostrils of Nadav and Avihu, and it burnt them all from the inside, started on the inside, and then burnt them totally on the outside as well. So that's what the other opinion says about that. But doesn't the pasuk regarding Nadav and Avihu say that the fire devoured them, and that implies their lives only, but not their bodies? That's how this Midrash is understanding these Pesukim. And so, in fact, they were not burned, a challenge to the view that they were burned. And the answer is no. Otam velo bigdehem. When it says otam specifically, it's a limiting word, and not something else. It doesn't mean and not their bodies, but rather it means and not their clothing. Their clothing was not burned, but their bodies were entirely burned, not only from the inside, but also from the outside. And that's why this opinion says, I'm going to learn it from Adat Korach and not from Nadav and Avihu. Okay, now we question these two opinions. One says Adat Korach, one says Nadav and Avihu. Each one says the other one was actually burned from the outside. Whereas the one that they pick was burned from the inside. But either way, whether you're learning from this one or that one, we're learning that the capital punishment is burning from the inside. But now we ask, Serefah is mentioned elsewhere in the Torah, V'nelef miparim nisrafim, and that is from some of the parim, the par chatat, like for Kohen Gadol. This is burnt outside of the Bet HaMikdash. So over there, that's actually burnt. You take the whole animal and you put it on the fire, all the parts that are not sacrificed. Malehalan serefa mamash, afkan serefa mamash. So just like over there, it's actually burning, and it says the word serefa. So to here, doesn't it mean actual burning? So this is, once you're going to make a gezerah shavah just from the word burning, learn it from parim, and that would mean that capital punishment, we burn the person on a fire. So now we have to see to which one is capital punishment most similar. Is it more similar to parachatat, that's burnt from the outside, or is it more similar to Adat Korach and Bnei Haron? Well, let's compare them. So it makes more sense to compare the capital punishment from the people, Bnei Adat Korach and Bnei Haron. Why? Because first of all, they all have to do with humans, whereas Parachatat is an animal. Second, they're all sinners. Bnei Adat Korach, Bnei Haron, and the candidate for capital punishment are all sinners. Neshama, they are all killed by burning, as opposed to the pad. The pad is actually killed by shechita. After shechita, and after you sprinkle the blood, then you burn the leftovers of the body on the fire, but it's not actually killed in that way. And pigul, the law of pigul only applies to the pad because it's a sacrifice if the person preparing it has in mind that he's going to the wrong time when he's going to do the rest of the service, then it's no good. Pigul does not apply in any of the other cases. So you see that these have four things in common. But now we ask the other way around. Maybe we should learn from animals, because animal and capital punishment have two things in common that the others don't have. Sheken machshir ledorot. Machshir means this is something that enables a mitzvah. The parachatat is a mitzvah to do that and enables the person to make teshuvah, and also giving capital punishment if someone deserves it is a mitzvah, and they can gain atonement by that. Whereas Adat Korach and Bnei Haron, there was no mitzvah in that fire coming down and doing it. It just came and destroyed them. And furthermore, ledorot, the law of capital punishment and the law of parachatat, that applies to all future generations. Whereas the incidents of Adat Korach and Bnei Haron were one-time only incidents, and so for that reason it would make more sense to compare capital punishment to the par, and therefore we should burn the person from the outside. So the answer is Hanach Nefishin. Yeah, but this comparison has 4 items, and this one only has 2 items, and therefore we're not going to compare capital punishment to the bull that's burned from the outside, but rather to Adat Korach or Bnei Haron, who are burned from the inside. Okay, now we asked one way, now we're going to ask the other way. The opinion that says we learn from Adat Korach, why not learn from Bnei Haron? Because they weren't they also burnt from the inside? And it says Serefa. Hahu Serefa mamash havai. No, Adat Korach thinks that Bnei Haron were actually burnt on the outside. V'nelaf mineh. Okay, fine. So if so, that Bnei Haron were burnt from the outside, so learn from that. Who told you to learn from Adat Korach that was burnt from the inside, according to this opinion, and not Bnei Haron who were burnt from the outside? It says Serefa here and it says Serefa there. So maybe capital punishment should be compared to Bnei Haron who were burnt from the outside, and also put the capital punishment person on a big fire. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Abba bar Abu, Amar Kera, V'havta l'recha kamocha beror lo mita yafa. We come back to this famous statement of Rav Nachman. Nachman in the name of Abba Abu that the pasuk says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." You should choose for him a good death. And being burnt on a bonfire is much more painful and horrible. And doing it the way the Mishnah from the inside is faster, less painful, and maintains the dignity of the body. That's actually why we're choosing the inside. But from the Pesukim, they are actually ambiguous because you could learn this one or that one. Okay, after all this, you're basically telling me we're choosing to kill the person on the inside because of Kamocha. So then why do you need the Gezer HaShavah to say, oh, it's like Adat Korach, and they were burned from the inside, and this also is burned from the inside? The Gezer HaShavah is actually ambiguous because there's another Gezer HaShavah. So really you just have Talcha Kamocha. So just stick with that. Who needs the Gezer HaShavah? Ilav Gezer HaShavah hamina serefat neshama v'guf kayam lav serefahi kelal. Oh, if not for the Gezer HaShavah, I would think that burning from the inside while the body is intact is not called burning. Maybe it's not, the definition of burning means from the outside, and if you do it from the inside, although it's nicer, you're not fulfilling burning. So I need the Gezer HaShavah, to Adat Korach, or if you like Ben Aaron better, if you think they were from the inside, I need a Gezer HaShavah to teach me that one of the definitions of Serefah is from the inside. Yes, Serefah could also mean from the outside, as it certainly does regarding the Pad. But as long as you tell me that there is a definition that it means from the inside, then I can use Rav Nachman's statement to know that I'm going to choose the one that means inside and not the definition that means outside. If I didn't have any Gezer HaShavah, I would think that burning from the inside, the life in the inside, but leaving the outside, the body intact, I would think that's not called Serefah at all. And the Torah says, listen, you have to do Serefah, and if you just burn from the inside, then you didn't fulfill the definition. And so I need a Gezer HaShavah to tell me that Serefah has two definitions, on the outside and on the inside. So again, without the Gezer HaShavah, I would think that Serefah means only on the outside. And although, burning on the inside would be better, would be nicer, but it just doesn't fulfill the definition. And in that case, if I thought that without the Gezer HaShavah, if Serefah means only burning from the outside, then what would I do with the pasuk? I would say that means that you have to put a lot of bundles of branches so that the fire will be very hot and he'll burn quicker and faster. So that would be the kind way of burning them from the outside to make it really hot so they burn quicker. So that's what I would think without the Gezer HaShavah. I would just think that Serefah means from the outside. That's what it certainly means regarding Pahad. And so this is the way I would have to do it. Kamash Malan, that's why I need the Gezer HaShavah to Adat Korach, that Serefah can mean from the inside. Okay, it can mean that. That's enough for me. Once I know it can mean from the inside, that's sufficient to fulfill Serefah. Okay, then I'm certainly going to choose that one, even though there's another Gezer HaShavah to Ben Aaron, who are, according to this opinion, from the outside. I'm going to choose the inside one because of love your neighbor. And now we go to a tangent of a story about Nadav and Avihu, who we just mentioned, that Moshe and Aaron were walking on the way, and Nadav and Avihu were walking behind them, and all of Israel was walking behind them, because they were going in order of importance. Amar lo Nadav lavihu, ema tayamutu sheneh zikenim alalu v'ani ve'ata nanhig et hador. Nadav said to Avihu, when will these two old people die so that me and you, we can be the leaders of the generation? They're like, we can't wait till Moshe and Aaron die. We'll die. Not a nice thing to say. Amar le HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hanireh mi koberet mi. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, well, let's see who buries whom. Right? It's not necessarily so that the younger will bury the older. Sometimes, as in this case, tragically, it went the other way around. Amar Rav Papa hainu damere inashe nefishi gamali sabeh detarini mashche dehugne. As the saying goes, Rav Papa says, the folk saying is, many are the old camels that are loaded with skins of young camels. Right? That this does happen. And this is kind of midah keneged midah. because they said, we can't wait till these old people die. They, in fact, died first. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Lema Talmid Chacham Domeh Lifnei Ha'aretz, Batechila Domeh Likiton Shel Zahav, Siper Himenu Domeh Likiton Shel Kesef, Nenem Mimenu Domeh Likiton Shel Cheres, Kevan Shenishbar, Shub En Lo Takana. Rabbi Eliezer teaches, what does a Talmid Chacham look like before an Am Ha'aretz? Well, at the beginning, the Talmid Chacham looks like a goblet of gold, and the Am Ha'aretz looks up to the Talmid Chacham and says, wow, look how shiny and nice this person is, and looks at them with respect. However, once they have a conversation, if the Talmid Chacham lowers himself to have a conversation with the Am Ha'aretz, then he's just going to look like silver. So his stature is diminished. And now, if the Talmid Chacham benefits from the Am Ha'aretz, this is related to Korach. He would go to the important people of his generation who were great people. They were like gold. But then he would feed them food and drink and bribe them and bring them down. So at that point, once the Talmid Chacham agrees to receive from the Am Ha'aretz, then he is just like an earthenware goblet, and we know about earthenware that once it's broken, it can never be put back together. So this is the slow downfall of a Talmid Chacham if he gives in to materialism and gives in to the wants of Amei Haaretz. Im rata bat Taleh bat Kohen shezinta havai akefa Rab Chama bar Tuviyah bilezemorot usrafa. Now a story that you had this woman Imrata bat Taleh. She was a bat Kohen and she committed adultery. And Rab Chama bar Toviyah surrounded her with bundles of branches and burnt her regular burning from the outside. Amar Rav Yosef ta'abed tarter. Rav Yosef said this rabbi did the wrong thing, and he made two mistakes. Ta'abed Rab Matana. First of all, he made a mistake with what Rab Matana says, that is burned using lead on the inside. ותעבד בדתניא, ובעתה אל הכהנים הלווים אל השופט אשר עמהם, בזמן שיש כהן, יש משפט, בזמן שאין כהן, אין משפט. And he made a further error, because the pasuk says that when there's a difficult case, you will come to the kohanim halviyim, the Levitical kohanim, and to the judge that will be in those days. We learn from this that when there is a kohen, then you can have capital punishment. When there's no kohen, you cannot adjudicate capital punishment. So even if he did it with lead, still, he was living at a time after the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, and we don't have a Kohen serving in the Bet HaMikdash, and therefore we cannot do capital punishment. So that was two things that Rav Toviyah, Rav Chamad Bar Toviyah was mistaken about. Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Sadok Maaseh bat Kohen shezinta. Now back to the Mishnah, where Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Sadok says there was a case of a bat Kohen who committed adultery, and they killed her by actual burning. Amar Rav Yosef betin shel Sadokim hava. Now the Mishnah said that this betin was not baki. They were not proficient, and so Rav Yosef explains that actually there were a Sadducean betin. The Sadducees follow a more literal reading of the Torah because they reject the Torah shebe'al peh. And therefore, Torah says, Ba'esh yisrofu. So I said that's what they put her on a bonfire and they burned her. It's not because they didn't know. They knew the law, but they knew the Sadducean law. And they knew that what the Pharisees say, what the rabbis say, but they rejected it. And so there were times in history when the Bet Din, the Sanhedrin, was controlled by Sadokim, and so this story came from that time. Hachi amar lehu v'hachi ahadru leh. Now we ask, is this the version of the story in the Mishnah correct, that Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok said this, and the sages answered him that, right? If so, but didn't they do this? Isn't that a precedent for burning? And then they said back to him, no, there was not baki. Is that really the version of the dialogue? We have another version in a Baraita. V'atanya amar Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Sadok, zechurani כשהייתי תינוק ומורכב על כתפו של אבא והביאו בת כהן שזינתה והקיפו אחריו לזמורות ושרפו. And this version, it's the same rabbi, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Sadok, as in the Mishnah, but here he says, I remember when I was a child and I was riding on my father's shoulders. So he was small enough to be able to ride on his father's shoulders. Not an infant, but like a toddler. And I saw, and I remember, you would have an impression, it might be one of his earliest memories, that they brought a Bat Kohen who committed adultery, and they surrounded her with branches, and they burned her from the outside. So isn't that a proof that that's the right way to do it? But they told him, no, you were a minor, and we cannot bring a proof from testimony of a minor. Right? Maybe minors have imaginations. I don't know what exactly you saw, what you remember you saw, but that's not a proof. So that's the conversation. So that's different from the conversation in Mishnah when they said that was a betin of Sadukim. So how do we resolve this? And the answer is, there were in fact two different stories. There were two different occasions that they were referring to, and so there were in fact two conversations, and both happened. Now which one came first? If it's the one in the Mishnah that came first, that doesn't make sense. At first he said it as an adult. He says, I remember that somebody was burned, and they told him no, it was a court of Sadducees. So then would he go after that and say, I remember when I was a minor? If they rejected his testimony as an adult, certainly they would reject his testimony when he was just a toddler. So it doesn't make sense if the stories happened in that chronological order. Rather, it must be that the Baraita happened first. And the rabbi said, I remember when I was a kid that there was someone who was actually burnt with fire on the outside. And they said, no, you were a minor, so you misremembered. And then he said, oh, but there was another time when I was an adult, and I saw such a thing. And that's when they answered him, no, because that betin was not proficient because it was a Sadducean betin. Next Mishnah, Misvat Neheragin. How do you do decapitation? All right, this is going to get a bit gory, so make sure you're not eating lunch. So they would chop off his head with a sword, the same way that the government does. That's the Romans. The Romans would do it by the person standing up, and the executioner would take a sword and swing it to the front of his neck, and thereby sever his windpipe, and probably most, if not all, of his head. And then the body would fall to the ground. So the Tanakama says that's how we do it, the same way that the Romans do beheading. Rabbi Yehuda says this is a disgrace. You're going to have the body standing up, and then it just falls to the floor like that, and the head flying off. And this is the way the Romans do it. So this is a disgraceful way of killing someone. Rather, we lie the person down, or make him kneel, and he put his head on a chopping block, and we chop it off with a cleaver. Okay, well, if you say this is not much more honorable, well, that's what they said. Amru lo en mita menuvelet mizo. That's the most degrading type of. It was like an animal, like you're butchering an animal with a cleaver on a chopping block. This is a horrible way, right? Better to do it with a sword, the way the Romans do it. So that both our sides are trying to find a way to do decapitation in the least degrading way, but it's hard to find a non-degrading way, and so they're arguing about which one is more degrading. Let's elaborate in the Gemara. Tanya, Amar lehen Rabbi Yehuda al Chachamim, Af ani yodea shemita menuveleti, aval ma eseh shara midat Torah b'chukotehem lo telechu. So Rabbi Yehuda, then we're continuing the conversation in the Braita. He tells Chachamim, says, I know that this is a terrible way, very degrading, to chop someone's head off on a chopping block with an axe. However, what can I do? I mean, I would agree in principle that swinging a sword at them while they're standing up is a little bit more honorable. But I can't choose that because the Torah says, do not follow their statutes. You cannot copy the practices of non-Jews. And so because the Romans do that one, if we would do it too, it would be like we're copying them. And therefore, that's off the table. So we have to do second best. And even though the second best is actually more degrading, because you're treating the person more like an animal with a cleaver, nevertheless, that's better than copying the Romans. What are they going to do with this pasuk? I thought you're not allowed to copy the Romans, the non-Jews. And the rabbis say, no, it talks about sword in the Torah, and therefore we didn't learn it from the Romans, we didn't learn it from any non-Jews. The Torah itself talks about chopping people's heads off with swords, and therefore We know it ourselves. So this is an important lesson, that just because something is done by non-Jews doesn't necessarily make it prohibited. If the Torah also talks about it and happens to be that non-Jews do something that the Torah also says, so then that's not called bechukotehem lo telechu. Dila temahachi hadetanya surfina la melachim velo midarkei amori hechi sarfinan vehaketib bechukotehem lo telechu. Because if you don't say this principle that you can follow you can copy what the non-Jews do as long as the Torah also has it, right? If you don't say that principle and you say that just because the Romans are doing it, then you can't do it at all, even if it's in the Torah, then you'll run into another problem regarding serefah, right? And the Braita says that we burn for kings, and that's not considered the ways of the Amorites. In other words, when the king dies, we take his vessels and his clothes, and to express our grief, and also no one should use it. So we burn all his vessels, the vessels of a king, when the king dies. Now, the non-Jews would do that, yet the Braita says that Jews are allowed to do that, and it's not called Darkei Amori. Now, how could you do that? Why don't you say B'chukotem lo telech, when since the non-Jews burn things when the king dies, then we can't copy them? Well, we don't say that. Ela kevan dichtib serefa b'oraita dichtib u'misrefot abotecha vegomer. Rather, since in the Torah, it's really in Yirmiyah, he tells Sidkiah, he says, don't worry, you are going to get an honorable burial, and the burnings of your fathers who came before you, they will make a burning for you. When you die, they will burn your property. That's considered an honor. So you see, Yirmiyah is referring to it. So therefore, that's obviously allowed. We didn't learn it from non-Jews. We had it beforehand. We had it for a long, long time. So since the Torah talks about beheading people with a sword, it's said regarding iranidachat, so therefore we learn that this is already from the Torah. Just because the Romans have it, the Romans, if anything, learned it from us, or they came up with it independently. But we didn't get it from them. We got it from the Torah itself, and therefore that does not fall under the prohibition of b'chukotehem lo telechu. V'haditnan bi'idach pirkin ve'elu hen haneheragin hadoseach ve'anshei iranidachat bishlam iranidachat kitibehu lefi chareb ela doseach min elan. Now, we learned going to learn in the coming up chapter that the following people get beheaded: a murderer and the people of iranidachat. And now, how do we know this? From the people of iranidachat, it says that we killed them lefi chareb, by a sword. So this is where we learn that you kill them by a sword, not with a cleaver. So that means we're swinging it and chopping their head off, indeed like the Romans do, but already the Torah has it way before. Okay, so that is explicit. But a murderer, how do you know that a murderer gets capital punishment by beheading? The Tanya, nakom yinakem, nikimazo eni odea mahu. Pasuk says, if someone kills a slave or a maidservant, and the maidservant, if he hits a slave, and the slave dies, then the slave's life will be avenged. Okay, so avenged by capital punishment. Now when it says nikima, I don't know what this means. Eni odea mahu, kishomer hebeti alechem, cherev nokemet nekam berit, have omer nikima zo saif. And another pasuk in the curses at the end of Vayikra, it says, I will bring upon you the sword, avenging the vengeance of the covenant. So it has nokemet, same word as yinakem, and it talks about with a sword. So we see that when it says nekama, it means by a sword. Therefore, the punishment for killing a slave is going to be beheading. So that's a type of murder. I know you just proved that nekama has to be with a sword, but there's many ways to kill with a sword. So maybe it means stabbing, not decapitation. And so if someone kills a slave, then they are stabbed to death. Lefi chareb ketiv. No, the pasuk says in iranidachat, lefi chareb, pi means the mouth. The mouth of the sword means the edge of the sword, not the point. And therefore it has to be that we give capital punishment by sword with the side of the sword. So that would indicate a decapitation. Hold on. You can actually kill someone with the side of the sword by cutting them in half, right? Cut them down the middle. So for this, we bring in the principle of love your neighbor, and a nice death is not slicing the person down the middle like they do in magic shows, but rather decapitation of some type is the more honorable death. diktal abda bar chorin min elan. Fine. That pasuk we proved that if someone kills a slave, then they get decapitated. But what if someone kills a free person? How do we know that the capital punishment for that also is hereg? V'lav kavachomer hu ketal abda b'saif bar chorin bechenek. Well, it's a kavachomer. If one kills a slave and one gets the capital punishment by a sword, so if you kill a free person, you think it's going to be the lesser form of punishment, which is strangulation. So you're not going to get lesser for killing a free person. If anything, more, but at least the same. So that we could figure out just from that it's the same. Good. That's a good answer. But it's only good answer according to the opinion that says chenek is less stringent, less severe than saif, so then you're not going to go one step down. But according to the Bishimon, who says chenek is actually more stringent, but then what do you have to say? Saif is the least stringent. So if the Torah says Saif is for an Eved, killing an Eved, then maybe for a free person, it goes up one step and it would be Chenek. Nafkalem b'detanya, v'ata teba'ir dam anakim mikirbecha, huksha kol shofchei damim, like Ladufa, mahalan b'saif min hasavad, afkan, b'saif min hasavad. Oh, because the Baraita says, you will put away innocent blood from your midst. By doing the ceremony of Egladufa, then you'll put away the innocent blood of the slain victim of the murder mystery. So we see that all spilling of blood, all murder, is compared to egladufa, because damnaki, that's murder, and that's mentioned in the context of egladufa. So just like egladufa, the calf itself, the heifer itself, is killed with a sharp object on its neck, so too all murderers are killed with a sword on its neck. Hold on. I know from this that you don't slice him in the middle or anything else, that he's killed with the sword on the neck and not by strangulation or anything else. So yeah, that I proved from here. But since you compared it, all murderers, to the Egla Arufa, well then, if you're really going to compare them, just like the Egla Arufa is killed from the back with a cleaver, so too all murderers then should be killed from the back of the neck with a cleaver. If you're going to really make this comparison, no, that's what we bring in again, to love your neighbor, and therefore we're going to find the most compassionate death, which is not breaking the neck from the back, but rather slaughtering from the front with a sword. And so here now we learn, according to the Bishimon, also that the punishment for all murder is in fact beheading, and that's learned from the comparison to Egladufa. Although it's not 100% comparison, we're not going to kill the murderer exactly the same as Egladufa, because we're going to do it in a nicer way, but still we learn that in the general category from Egla Arufa. Last Mishnah for today is how we do strangulation. So similar to the Nisrafin, except that we don't use the wick, we just strangle him to death. And so we submerge the person in dung up to his knees. That way he's not going to move around or just flop around, and we have more control. And then we put a piece of cloth that's hard within a soft one, just like imagine a long a scarf. And so you take a tough rope and you put it around it, a soft scarf, so that way it won't be abrasive to his skin. Even though he's about to be strangled to death, he shouldn't have to suffer an extra pain of having his neck scratched by a rough surface. And we put the scarf around his neck, and each of the witnesses pull from one side and the other until he dies of strangulation. Tenor banan ish perat lekatan asherin afet eshet re'ehu et eshet ish perat le'eshet katan eshet re'ehu perat le'eshet acherim. Now the punishment of strangulation is the standard punishment for adultery for a woman who's a nisu'ah. So the pasuk that teaches standard adultery is ish, and is this pasuk, and we're going to analyze each part of it by atomizing and what we learn from each word. So ish that comes to exclude a minor. If the male who commits adultery with a married woman is a minor, then he does not get killed because he's just a minor. He never doesn't get killed for anything that he does, except the ben surah moreh. But I'm saying for any sin that he actually commits. Asherin afet eshet ish, if he commits adultery with the wife of a man, that comes to exclude the wife of a child. If the boy is a minor and he does a marriage ceremony with a woman, that marriage is not a full marriage because the boy is a minor. And therefore, if she commits adultery, then that's not considered punishable adultery because the marriage is not full with a minor. And eshet ra'ehu, that comes to exclude eshet acherim, the wife of a non-Jew. That's not considered also legal marriage, a non-Jew. And therefore, that adultery with a non-Jewish, with someone married to a non-Jew is not considered punishable adultery by capital punishment. Mochumat bechenek. Now, mochumat, this is the key word that we need. The Midrash says that this is strangulation. Now, it really just says, shall be put to death. So how do you know it means strangulation? Maybe it means one of the other types of capital punishment. Amarta, kol makom shenemar mita b'torah stam, en ata rasha l'moshcha lachmir aleha, ela lakel aleh. Rabbi Yoshia. So Rabbi Yoshia argues that any time the Torah says just a plain, kill the person, so you cannot assume that it's going to be more stringent, right? If the Torah says stone the person, okay, then we know stoning. Burn, then we know burning. But if it doesn't say anything, then we have to pick the most lenient one because it's not up to us to decide that the person should get something more stringent than is said, and therefore we're going to pick the most lenient since it doesn't say anything at all. That's the argument of Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonatan omer, lo mipnei shehi kala ela kol mita mora b'torah stam ena ela chenek. Rabbi Yonatan agrees with the conclusion, but for a different reason, not necessarily because it's more lenient. In fact, there's a machloket about which one is the most lenient. Rather, this is just a rule that if the Torah says that person gets killed and without any specification, then that means strangulation. That's just the rule. Rabbi Omer, ne'emar mita b'dei shamayim ve'ne'emar mita b'dei adam. Ma mita mora b'dei shamayim mita she'en ba roshem, af mita mora b'dei adam mita she'en ba roshem. Rabbi has a different reason. It says the word mita when it comes to death at the hands of heaven, meaning a natural death. And mita, that's given by man, and capital punishment is also called mita. He uses the same word. And so we can compare the two words. Just like when it says death regarding a natural death, this is death that has no external mark. And so too, if we say mita regarding in human hands, and it doesn't say stoning is going to leave a mark, and so is, burning is inside, but still, is pretty invasive, and beheading certainly leaves a mark. That's for sure. So if it doesn't say anything at all, then we're going to pick the one that has the least amount of damage to the body, and that would be strangulation, where the person just expires from lack of oxygen, but there's no external injury. Hold on, maybe serefa, because that also doesn't leave a mark. So that's just burning from the inside. No, since the Torah says that a bat kohen gets serefa, so that is excluding bat kohen from the general category of idolatry. So that means that the general category of idolatry is not serefa. So in fact, chenek and serefa are two that leave no mark. Stoning and decapitation do leave a mark. So certainly the stam mita is not going to be those two. Stam mita could be serefa, doesn't leave a mark. But since Bat Kohen says that she is different and she gets serefa, different from the regular adultery, so the regular adultery must be something different from serefa, and the only thing left is chenek that doesn't leave a mark. Bishlama Rabbi Natan kedeka mefaresh Rabbi Ta'ama. Now we understand, according to Rabbi Yonatan, he is explained by Rabbi. In other words, Rabbi Yonatan said this is just the rule, and Rabbi explained that we're looking for something that doesn't leave a mark, and so that's how we know that there is such a thing as the form of capital punishment of strangulation, because we need a form of capital punishment that won't leave a mark. It can't be serefa because that's used by a bat kohen, so it has to be something different. And so that's how we know for sure that there is such a thing. However, according to the Rabbi Yoshia, he just says pick the thing that's the most lenient. Well, then how do you know that there is even such a thing as chenek? The point is that the Torah never says explicitly that someone should be strangulated. That's not one of the options that's explicitly stated. That's what we're talking about the stam, and we're matching up when the Torah doesn't say anything at all. We're matching it up with chenek. So it makes sense according to the other opinion, because he said that we're looking for something that doesn't leave a mark. Okay, that would be chenek. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, he just says, well, we're picking something that is most lenient. So just pick something else that's most lenient. How do you know that it's chenek? Maybe the most lenient is saif. Out of there's just only 3 options, and if it doesn't say anything at all, we can't assume something more stringent. So we'll pick the most lenient out of the 3 that we know that the Torah talks about. So maybe say there's only 3 types of capital punishment, according to the Yoshia. Rava answers, there's an oral tradition that there's 4. So we know there has to be 4. The Torah only mentions explicitly 3. So we have to come up with the 4th one. So what's going to be the 4th one? All right, no problem. According to the B, it'll be one that leaves no mark. That's chenek. And according to Rabbi Yoshia, well, we have to come up with one, and because we know there has to be 4. So that's how we come up with chenek. Now, how come Rabbi Yonatan says not because it's the most lenient? Isn't it the most lenient? So why is he arguing against Rabbi Yoshia? The answer is that Rabbi Yonatan and Rabbi Yoshia are aligning themselves with Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan. So Rabbi Yoshia follows Rabbanan. It says, well, we have to find something that's the most lenient. And so we know there's 4, so we have to find something that's very lenient because we can't assume anything worse. So what would be the most lenient possible way of killing someone? That would be strangulation. So that's why Rabbanan says that if the Torah doesn't say anything at all, for the other 3 it says, do this, do capital punishment, do stoning, do burning, do decapitation. So those, it goes out of its way to say what it is. If it doesn't say, then it's the more lenient of all of them. And the most lenient way to kill someone would be, in fact, strangulation. That's Rabbanan. However, if you agree with Rabbi Shimon, then it's not the most lenient. And so we have to find a different reason. So why would you pick the standard one if it doesn't say anything to be the second most lenient? Well, the answer is because we want to find something that leaves no mark. And decapitation, even though it's the most lenient, does leave a mark. And therefore, the standard one, when the Torah doesn't say, is the second most lenient, which is decapitation. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.